Hello students, and welcome to lecture number 9 in Dr. Lewis's course on European history, 1500 to the present. Today's lecture will be dealing with the subject of the path to World War II, looking at international diplomacy and different dynamics of the 1930s that led to the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. In our previous video module, we looked at how different corporate leaders throughout the world helped to bring about the rise of Adolf Hitler and the strength of Nazi Germany. Today we'll be taking a slightly different approach, looking at more of the aspect of politics and international diplomacy, addressing the following 4 questions. Number 1, how did world leaders react to the rise of Adolf Hitler? Number 2, who tried to organize resistance against Hitler? Number 3, why did Hitler's armies plan on conquering to the east? And number 4, what impact did the 1939 non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union have upon global politics? One of the themes we addressed in our previous lectures concerning World War I was the punitive nature of the Treaty of Versailles. Number 1, for the fact that Germany had lost World War I. When they sat down to sign the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was blamed for the entirety of World War I and had to pay a huge amount of reparations to the victorious Allies. The other problem is just because one was on the winning side of World War I does not mean that your nation actually got anything. Both Italy and Japan had been on the Allied side in World War I, both being promised empires throughout Asia and throughout northern Africa. At the end of the war, when the Treaty of Versailles was signed, both of these nations received little to nothing for their participation in the war. Essentially, what these 3 nations had in common was not necessarily a shared fascist ideology, but all 3 shared a disposition that the Treaty of Versailles was unjust and been a betrayal of the principles of peace. The Treaty of Versailles needed to be overturned. One of the ways to try to stop the rise of these fascist powers then in overturning the Treaty of Versailles was to get the old coalition of World War I back together again. Essentially, a coalition between the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain would be an unstoppable force that Hitler realizes he could not beat if these 3 nations were unified together. The problem is, particularly after the Russian Revolution, is there were several generations now of distrust between the major powers, and the only 3 major world leaders who were willing to put their differences aside were President Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. The problem is, throughout the majority of the 1930s, these three leaders are not in power at the same time. One of the other problems when it comes down to politics of the 1930s is after the Great Depression gripped the American economy and then had a ripple effect throughout the entire world, mass unemployment plagued capitalist economies. In some places like Germany, when Hitler came to power, unemployment rates were up to almost 33%. Once Hitler started down a path of constructing a military to prepare for World War II, this helped create jobs. But the problem was, since Hitler and Germany were bankrupt when Hitler came to power, Hitler had to convince different corporations why they should be willing to trust him and to build equipment for him. What Hitler essentially did was set up a credit plan with different major corporations to produce armaments for the German military on the condition that starting in January of 1938, that Germany would start repaying the debts on this credit-based economy. In order to stop Hitler then, all that the major powers needed to do was, number 1, bring together a unification of the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain, and number 2, cut off the money and the war supplies coming into Nazi Germany. By creating such a diplomatic and economic alliance, World War II could be prevented and Hitler toppled without a single shot being fired. While Adolf Hitler was a sociopath, he wasn't a stupid man, and he understood the great challenges facing the German nation when it came to international diplomacy during the 1930s. Hitler needed to make sure that the old alliances of World War I did not come back together, because such a unity in international relations would prevent him from his larger aspirations of marching German armies to the east and conquering the Soviet Union, toppling Joseph Stalin's communist regime in Russia. To make sure that he was able to fulfill this larger dream and conquest, Hitler made an alliance in January of 1934 with the small East European nation of Poland, essentially setting up a corridor between Germany and Russia for any future marches of German troops. March of 1935, Hitler started down the path of making sure that he had enough troops to be able to conquer the great expanse of Russia. Even though the world was still technically at peace in March of 1935, it became obvious to world leaders all around that Hitler was serious about utilizing war to overturn the Treaty of Versailles and to conquer the Soviet Union. To try and prevent this from happening, leaders from France, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union came together in May of 1935 to sign a military alliance, essentially stipulating that if any of these three nations was ever threatened by Germany in the future, that the other nations would come to their military aid. This was supposed to be step number one in looking back at the old alliances of World War I and looking forward to the future, that if these alliances were recreated, that World War II could be prevented. Hitler, fearing that he was now getting boxed in on all sides, facilitated a potential nightmare war, reached out across the English Channel to the United Kingdom of Great Britain. In June of 1935, British and German representatives signed what was called the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. What this agreement did was start a process in motion that if World War II were to ever occur, it would be a war of Germany and Britain as friends and allies against an alliance of the Soviet Union and France. While many German leaders and British leaders thought this was an interesting proposal, there was one who stood out in the fold and condemned this proposal. This was Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill argued that if he were ever made British Prime Minister, that the first thing he would do is tear up this naval agreement and sign an alliance with France and the Soviet Union, boxing Hitler on all sides and bringing about a process of international unity that would make sure that World War II never occurred. The problem for the British public and for peace-loving peoples throughout the world is Winston Churchill is not going to become the British Prime Minister until the summer of 1940, approximately 8 months after the outbreak of World War II. In 1936, Hitler started focusing in on trying to secure the raw materials the German military would need for an invasion of the Soviet Union. One of the great challenges for Germany in the 20th century is that Germany has no oil resources there on its own land, and that most of the oil resources in the 1930s were owned by the United States, the Soviet Union, and various nations of the Middle East. To try and overcome this challenge, in January of 1936, Adolf Hitler offered a number of contracts to scientists at General Motors and IG Farben to develop a synthetic fuel technology that essentially the German military machine would not run on gasoline, but a synthetic fuel derived from Germany's great coal resources. In July of 1936, Hitler took this aspect a step further, recognizing that Spain also had some of the greatest coal resources in the entirety of the European continent. July of 1936, a civil war broke out in the Iberian Peninsula of the newly established Spanish Republic, fighting initially against the monarchist forces of Francisco Franco, the general of the Spanish army. Francisco Franco despised the Republic and had promised King Alfonso about 5 years prior to 1936 that if opportunity ever came, that Franco would use the military might of Spanish forces to overthrow the Republic and to put the king back on his throne. After resistance started spreading throughout the Spanish Republic, Franco realized that his initial goal of restoring the monarchy wasn't going to work out, and that he instead needed to look to the fascist forces of Europe for assistance and to put out the vision of establishing a fascist dictatorship there in Spain. Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler were more than happy to assist Francisco Franco, not just ideologically, but Spain essentially offered Italian and German commanders a place to begin training their militaries to prepare for World War II. It's one thing for a soldier to go through boot camp, but a soldier who's simply been through boot camp and never been tested on the battlefield, it's not a very good soldier. Essentially, Spain became the training ground for fascism to prepare for World War II. Not only was it the fascists preparing there in Spain, but General Motors also needed a place to show off their new military products they designed in 1935. In 1935, General Motors had designed the Adam Opel Blitz truck, which was the fastest troop carrier in the world, but they had not yet had an opportunity to show off what this troop carrier could do on the battlefield. During 1936, General Motors reached out to Francisco Franco and provided him 6,000 of these troop carrier trucks on credit. What this facilitated was now General Motors could show off the efficiency of their product to Italian and German commanders, thus establishing future business contracts with Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Franco reflected in 1945, after the victory of the Spanish Civil War, that, quote, without American trucks and American credit, we could never have won the Civil War. One of the deep concerns that Hitler had was how other people throughout the international community would react to the domestic policies of Nazi Germany, particularly when it came to anti-Semitism and the persecution of Jews. In 1931, before Hitler came to power, Germany had been chosen to be the site for the Olympic Games of 1936. In August of 1936, before the Olympic Games were held there in Berlin, Hitler essentially hid away all public signs of persecution of Jews and took down anti-Jewish propaganda throughout the German nation. When journalists from other nations arrived then in Berlin, number one, they didn't see all the anti-Semitism that they'd heard about from other people who had been to Germany. Number two, they were astounded by new technological feats advanced by German scientists during the 1930s, in particular when it came to media. Journalists who could not get in to the Olympic Stadium for different events in Berlin had the option of going to about a dozen different pubs throughout the capital to watch what was transpiring on a television set. If you weren't aware of it, the Nazis invented television, and that the first television broadcast in human history was in August of 1936 of Adolf Hitler opening the Olympic Games in Berlin. Essentially, what Hitler was trying to do here in his partnerships with Franco, General Motors, IG Farben, and his advancement of new media was trying to manipulate public perception throughout the world that Hitler was a threat to the world or a potential threat to Jews. Building upon his successes of 1936, Adolf Hitler spent much of 1937 trying to reach out to other major international leaders in a spirit of friendship, trying to increase his power and prestige throughout the world. A success that eventually culminated in 1938 with Adolf Hitler being named Time Man of the Year. What Hitler attempted to tap into was the traditional anti-communist, anti-socialist sentiment of European leaders. In January of 1937, Hitler spoke out a number of times calling for a European-wide alliance against the Soviet Union and a military coalition to come together to topple Stalin's communist regime. In May of 1937, Adolf Hitler also sent out initial wishes to King George VI, congratulating him on becoming the new king of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Prior to the ascension of King George VI, one of the reasons why Hitler believed that Britain would become a natural ally of Nazi Germany was that Hitler himself had a close personal friendship with King Edward VIII and the woman who Edward VIII eventually married after abdicating from the throne, Wallis Simpson. After congratulating King George VI on his ascension to the throne, King George followed the lead of his older brother, King Edward VIII, and sent messages back wishing Hitler good health and prosperity in the future, essentially signaling that the new British monarch had no qualms or problems with Hitler's Nazi regime. In June of 1935, to increase his international prestige amongst business leaders, Adolf Hitler convinced Thomas Watson, CEO of IBM, to hold the International Chamber of Commerce meeting not in its originally scheduled location of New York, but in the German capital of Berlin. While in Berlin, Thomas Watson was awarded the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, and Thomas Watson published a number of public statements that we looked at in previous lectures afterwards, thanking Hitler for all of the kind regards and wishing Hitler health and happiness when it came to the future. It's one thing having a king on your side and having a business leader thank you for awards, but it's a whole other thing to get a government's foreign ministry to join in on your side. To facilitate this, Adolf Hitler had his third in command, Hermann Göring, reach out to the British leader, Lord Halifax, inviting Lord Halifax to come to Nazi Germany to go on a hunting trip with Hermann Göring. During this time, the two leaders discussed aspects of hunting, but primarily what they talked about was politics and international relations. At the time, Hermann Göring proposed the signing of what he called a British and German Friendship Pact, establishing that if war ever broke out, that while these two powers might not come to each other's aid, that these two powers would never go to war with each other ever in the future. Lord Halifax agreed this was a very good idea and said he would take home this idea to propose it to the new British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. In January of 1938, Adolf Hitler and leaders of the international business community started panicking because the payment plan on Hitler's credit to build up the German military, the payments began in January of 1938, and Adolf Hitler was still broke. Hitler's backup plan they had always had for financing the German military was the persecution of German Jews. Starting in January of 1938, huge pressure started being put upon Jews to leave Germany, and Hitler said the only way they could leave Germany and avoid further persecution was they'd be granted a travel visa to leave the country, but number one, they could never come back, and number two, they had to leave all of their wealth behind, essentially showing up as refugees in other nations, penniless. This was a way for Hitler to try and gain wealth very quickly to start payments on his debts. Number two, in January of 1938, Hitler also started having non-Jewish Germans register if they were interested in further expansion to the east. Essentially, the idea of creating Eastern pioneers who someday would invade and help to take over territories throughout Poland and throughout Russia as part of a larger and expanded Third Reich. Of course, in order to register for this pioneer program, ordinary Germans had to pay a registration fee. In March of 1938, as a huge violation of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany became politically united with Austria. The story of the Austrian onslaught is documented in popular culture in the traditional musical The Sound of Music. Hitler argued at the time that he was simply trying to reunite all Germanic peoples into one larger empire, and that this was the true goal of taking over Austria. The reality was a bit different, though. March of 1938, Hitler still has a bunch of bills to pay, and the interest rates on those loans to pay for the rearming of Germany, well, the interest rates were going up every month. When Germans arrived in the Austrian capital of Vienna, they raided the treasury, sent Austrian funds back to Berlin, and used this money to continue paying down Germany's debts. Even though this was a violation of the Treaty of Versailles, Britain and France did nothing to stop him. In July of 1938, Adolf Hitler tried to cement a further relationship and bond between his ideological forefather, Henry Ford. On Henry Ford's 75th birthday in July of 1938, huge parades were thrown throughout the city of Detroit, primarily by school children, to celebrate the influence that Ford had had upon the entire world. At the birthday party held for Ford there in Detroit, Hitler had the German ambassador to the United States travel to Detroit to meet with Henry Ford and to grant him the Grand Cross of the German Eagle as a personal birthday gift from Adolf Hitler, once again trying to secure a greater sense of prestige in international affairs. In September of 1938, Hitler decided to test the world community further, particularly the alliance between France, the Soviet Union, and Czechoslovakia, by demanding that the western territories of Czechoslovakia that were called the Sudetenland be given to Germany. Hitler argued publicly at the time that the majority of people who lived in the Sudetenland were ethnically German and should therefore, like the Austrians, be part of a larger German empire. The reality of Hitler's Sudetenland policies was a bit different. Number one, he was trying to test out the will of the international community, but number two, there was a huge factory owned by the Skoda Works there in the Sudetenland that specialized in the creation of Panzer tanks. Prior to this, Skoda Works refused to extend Adolf Hitler any further credit to purchase Panzer tanks, so Hitler wanted to take over Skoda Works and essentially have the German government control the factory themselves. France at the time panicked, arguing that Hitler might go to war over this issue, and they were afraid of having to mobilize their army to protect Czechoslovakia and to fulfill their alliances. Joseph Stalin saw this as an opportunity to prove to the world that he was serious about taking on Adolf Hitler. What Stalin did at the time was ordered a full mobilization of the Russian Red Army, arguing that he would march troops right through Poland if he had to protect Czechoslovakian independence from any future threats from Nazi Germany. Coming into this then, that world was left with the question, how would Britain and France react to Hitler's aggression? To try and ease international tensions around the demands concerning the Sudetenland, Hitler called for a conference of major European leaders to take place in the German city of Munich on September 29, 1938. Representatives from Great Britain, France, Italy, and Germany came together to decide the future fate of Czechoslovakia. Ironically enough, though the Soviets had mobilized their army to protect Czechoslovakia, Soviet representatives were not invited. And even more ironic for the fact that the future of Czechoslovakia was being decided here in the German city of Munich, Czechoslovakia was also not invited to participate in the conference. Adolf Hitler argued to the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain that if the Sudetenland were handed over to Hitler, that he wouldn't ask for any more, that this was a reasonable request, that the people who lived there were ethnically German, and Hitler argued that these people wanted to be part of the Third Reich. Neville Chamberlain, while a little hesitant on some of these ideas, believed that this was the only route to save world peace in 1938. Chamberlain agreed to Hitler's demands. Hitler, seeing an opportunity for advancement in British and German relations, also brought up the ideas that Lord Halifax and Hermann Göring had discussed the previous fall with creating a friendship pact between Britain and between Germany. Believing that he was, quote, saving peace in our time, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain signed this friendship pact between Britain and between Nazi Germany, now stating that if a war ever happened, it would never be a war between British forces and German forces. Hitler essentially believed after the Munich conference that he was being given a green light by other major powers to go to war, primarily because his troops were marching to the east towards the Soviet Union. On October 10, 1938, German forces marched in the Sudetenland, taking control of this territory, which now meant Adolf Hitler had control of the largest tank factory in all of Europe. Coming out of this, even though Stalin had mobilized the entirety of the Russian Red Army, he realized without any Western support that he was going to have a very difficult time protecting Czechoslovakia. Stalin came out of this scenario believing that the West could no longer be trusted. Another person who reacted against this was Winston Churchill. As other British politicians praised Neville Chamberlain for signing this friendship pact, Winston Churchill denounced it and said that Chamberlain had not saved peace in our time, but had given Hitler a green light for World War II. Churchill started making demands that Neville Chamberlain be thrown out of power and that the British people install Winston Churchill as the new Prime Minister, arguing as Prime Minister he would tear up the friendship pact with Germany, and once again coming through on his promise that he would immediately sign an alliance with France and the Soviet Union, and that World War II could be prevented. In a series of last-ditch efforts to rally the world community against Adolf Hitler, President Franklin Roosevelt of the United States and Premier Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union made public speeches to their own governments, hoping that the speeches would be carried throughout the world and would rally world opinion against the threats of Adolf Hitler when it came to World War II. In his speech to a joint session of Congress, President Roosevelt stated, "In meeting the troubles of the world, we must meet them as a united front of one people. If another form of government can present a united front in its attack on democracy, the attack must be met by a united democracy." Roosevelt stating that the world needed was unity, and that unity could stop Hitler in his tracks. Joseph Stalin argued to the Soviet Congress, quote, "The Soviet Union will not be drawn into conflict by warmongers who are accustomed to having others pull the chestnuts onto the fire for them. If the Western powers proceed with this dangerous political game, it may end in a serious fiasco for them." Once again, Stalin saying that he was more than willing to sign an alliance with any powers coming to visit him but the time was running out, and that if Western powers did not act to solidify this alliance with the Soviet Union, that they might not like the results of the world that would occur. Although Stalin and Roosevelt sent a rallying call out to world leaders to unite to stop Adolf Hitler, British and French leaders spent the first several months of 1939 following their appeasement policies of the following year to try to make friends with the fascist powers to make sure that if a war happened, it would be the fascist powers marching to the east to topple the Soviet Union, not the fascist powers threatening Western Europe at all. On February 27, 1939, British and French leaders gave Francisco Franco formal diplomatic recognition. What this meant in the eyes of the international community was that Franco was now recognized the undisputed fascist dictator of Spain. What this also meant was that German and Italian forces who had been bogged down fighting the Spanish Civil War on Franco's side were now freed up to go to other places in Europe to advance the military aspirations of Hitler and Mussolini. On March 16, 1939, German forces took over the rest of the nation of Czechoslovakia, and when German forces arrived in the Czechoslovakian capital of Prague, they looted the treasury, sent these funds back to Berlin, and continued on with their payment plans to Western corporations. Several days later, Adolf Hitler made the demand that territories of Poland that had belonged to Germany prior to World War I be given back, and that Germany would no longer recognize the Treaty of Versailles that had created the state of Poland. On March 31, 1939, British and French diplomats broke with their policies of appeasement and signed an alliance with Poland, arguing that if Poland were ever threatened by Nazi Germany with direct physical force, that British and French troops would come to Poland's aid. The problem for Poland in this scenario is that Britain and France do not border on Poland. So on April 16, 1939, Joseph Stalin contacted British and French diplomats and requested that the Soviet Union be brought into this pact, and that the Soviet Red Army could be the protectors of Polish sovereignty. Since no formal moves were made at this time to create this alliance, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini believed, perhaps rightfully so at the time, that the international community would do nothing to stop them. On May 7, 1939, Hitler and Mussolini signed what was called the Pact of Steel, now creating a formal military alliance between Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany to prepare the Axis powers of World War II. Fearing that war might break out any day now, finally British and French diplomats visited the Soviet Union on August 11, 1939. At this point, Joseph Stalin had been requesting such a meeting for well over 5 years, and it took 5 years for British and French diplomats to finally get the courage to come to Moscow to negotiate with Stalin. The problem in this scenario is Stalin proposed a number of different measures. Particularly, he proposed the idea of Russian troops marching into Poland and to Czechoslovakia, surrounding Germany on the Eastern Front, while at the same time French troops would surround Germany on the Western Front, and that British troops would blockade German ports and essentially box Hitler in on all sides, and that World War II would be prevented. While British and French diplomats thought this was an interesting proposal, they had been given no formal authority to actually sign anything with the Soviet Union, just the authority to talk to Stalin. On August 17, 1939, British and French diplomats left Moscow without signing any formal treaties, recreating the old alliance system of World War I. At this point, Joseph Stalin gave up on the idea of recreating the old World War I coalition and decided to pull a diplomatic ace out of his sleeve that he'd been hiding for several months from the world community. In the late spring of 1939, Joseph Stalin secretly began forming his own insurance policy, essentially a backup plan in case Western powers betrayed him and didn't come through an alliance. On August 23, 1939, Stalin revealed to the world community his secret plan he'd been negotiating for several months, which was a non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. This pact was not an alliance between Germany and Russia, but was a 10-year peace proposal saying that for the next 10 years these two powers would not attack each other, they would not join in with any coalitions, that would threaten the other, essentially saying putting a pause on hostile relations between these two countries for a period of a decade. Stalin believed that war with Nazi Germany would be inevitable in the future, and that he needed more time to prepare his nation for what he believed would be the Soviets taking on Nazi Germany single-handedly. Hitler, now believing that the Soviets would stay out of any conflict that broke out, began the German invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, utilizing blitzkrieg tactics, which translates generally to lightning war. Remember, Hitler had the Panzer tanks, and he had the fastest troop carriers in the world, and that most Polish soldiers who came out to fight the German military actually came out on horseback. Horseback versus Panzer tank. Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain contacted the Polish government and recommended immediately that they negotiate with Nazi Germany a surrender. When it became obvious that Polish troops weren't going to simply roll over and surrender to Nazi Germany, Britain and France came through on their alliance obligations and officially declared war on Nazi Germany September 3, 1939, bringing an official beginning to World War II. A couple of weeks later, the Soviets invaded eastern parts of Poland, essentially creating a buffer zone between Nazi Germany and between the Soviet Union, with Poland being split in half by two mutually hostile forces. Over the next several months, Soviet forces started arriving in the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and even took up parts of Finland, creating a walled barrier between Germany and between Russia. At this point now, though, World War II was officially proclaimed, but no British or French troops arrived in Poland to assist their Polish ally. During this time, journalists made jokes that what was going on was a quote-unquote phony war, and Joseph Stalin believed that the reason why British and French soldiers weren't actually attacking was that British and French diplomats were having secret negotiations with Hitler to create an anti-Soviet alliance, which might sound a little bit paranoid, but it's true. It is actually what was transpiring and the main reason why British and French soldiers were not going on the attack. What's going to change in our next lecture on May 10th, 1940 is there's going to be a vote of no confidence in the British Parliament against Neville Chamberlain, and Winston Churchill will be made the new Prime Minister of Great Britain. Hitler, realizing that Britain would no longer follow a policy of appeasement, Hitler immediately invaded Western Europe, and World War II began on the Western Front. While this war was predictable and preventable if a coalition of World War I allies had come together, the disunity of the international community facilitated the outbreak of World War II and Hitler advancing on his plans for conquering the European continent. What we'll explore in our next lecture is what eventually brought the United States and the Soviet Union into a grand coalition with Great Britain to take on Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, the Axis powers.